from the Australian Institute of International Affairs will talk about think tank contribution to the G20. And actually, she will go first in the presentation. And Mark Elder from the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies will talk on G20 and the Sustainable Development Goals. The last presentation we have in this panel is Katsuo Matsushita from Kyoto University. He's also the co-chair of the G20 Climate Change Task Force, and he will talk about G20 contributions to G20 Osaka Summit on climate and environment. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much, particularly to the organisers for giving me another excuse to come and return to Japan. It's been a wonderful conference so far, and it's an honour to be part of this fascinating discussion. So my paper is coming first because it's a little different. I'm not looking specifically at environmental governance or at any other sort of governance. Is that on?
No.
Great. I'm looking at a type of actor, think tanks, and what sort of contribution they're having to the world of international affairs. How are they involved in the G20 process? So what I'm going to do first is locate this as part of the broader thinking on think tanks and diplomacy. How are they involved? And then I'm going to look specifically at the Think 20 process, one of the engagement groups that brings the think tanks into the G20. Now, I got into this when I was asked to write a book on think tank diplomacy. And my first response when I got that was from Brill is, is that a thing? Is that something actually right about it? To think, is there such a thing as think tank diplomacy? So, anyone know what that is? David, I'm sure, knows what that is. Okay, so that's the Spratlys in the South China Sea. I'm going to take a day. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what think tanks were doing that day. On this day, 15 December 2016, CSIS brought out some of its Maritime Transparency Initiative photos. So we could see the extent of the Great Wall of Sand that was being built. The China installed weapons on disputed islands. These satellite images went everywhere. They went on to CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. The Chinese Foreign Minister, under pressure, put out a response, and you start to see for the first time the EU getting interested, talking with, so Chancellor Merkel describes this as a serious conflict. Also in the same day, on the 15th of December, the International Crisis Group brings out a Brussels-based think tank, brings out a report looking at a new Muslim insurgency in Rakhine province, led by immigrants from different groups. Got significant attention. It's the start of what we now see as huge political movements. And a few days later, the foreign ministers from ASEAN, in a great departure from their usual practice, brought out had a discussion situation and brought out a statement. And finally on that day, 15 December 2016, we saw the evacuation of citizens following the ceasefire in the Syria civil war. So you had the involvement of a think tank, independent diplomat, in the actual negotiations, while other think tanks such as the Syrian Human Rights Observatory, the Centre for Conflict Negotiation and Recovery and the Syrian Centre for Policy Research all tracked development and what was happening. So my argument is that something's going on. Okay, so think tanks are clearly involved in what's happening in international affairs in some way. Potentially they're playing diplomatic roles or they're supporting diplomats in what they do. So to investigate that, what I looked into is a pretty simple method. What are think tanks, what's diplomacy, and what role are they playing? Can I come up with a model for it? Now, I used a pretty simple definition of think tanks. I think there's a big definition. You can use big definitions to say that it's any organisation that does anything that calls itself a think tank, or you can use pretty minimal ones saying it has to be a non-profit, not associated with the government, etc., etc. I use the big one, which is that it's an organisation, so not just an individual. It trains to have an influence on public policy, and it does that through producing independent intellectual inputs. Okay, and what follows from that is clearly it's not a lobbyist because they're not producing independent intellectual inputs, they're just out there as a marketing firm. It's not academia because you're not doing it in that sort of advocacy way, and it's not media. So if you look at those things, programs, those think tanks, can they do diplomacy? It's not as easy as you might think to decide that. So unless you use an entirely circular definition and say diplomacy is what diplomats do, and that's the end of the matter, you have to then define what do you mean by diplomacy. And so if I get you to picture in your head what you think of diplomacy, I'm guessing it's something like this, gentlemen. So meet Sir Henry Mortimer Durand, remembered with Durand Line, which is the Afghan border. And we used to have an idea of diplomacy that it was very much, an exclusive club. It was gentlemen talking to other gentlemen to manage the relations between states, sovereigns. There's been a real evolution in how we understand diplomacy, and so we now see it much more moving from that club to more of a network idea, so that it involves a range of actors, potentially, and so it's more of a behaviour rather than identity. There are certain things that diplomats do, but potentially others can do those too. So you tend to see it more in terms of diplomatic functions. So if I'm looking, say, international law definition of what's diplomacy, really most of those can be done by non-officials, apart from the representing the government. Or if I'm looking at theorists, who try to define what diplomacy is, this one's Hedley Ball, a great Australian theorist. Similar approach, you could say non-officials can't symbolise the state in international relations, but they can do pretty much everything else. So from that, I generated the different diplomatic functions, which I think are out there. I've got 4. I'm sure there could be more, but those 4 I think are very clear and evident ones. You do negotiations, you do communications, you gather information, and you promote friendly relations. I then looked at how they can potentially be done both directly and indirectly. So directly, actually doing the negotiations, or indirectly training diplomats in how to do negotiations. And I tried to come up with catchy titles, whether you like them or not. I then looked at case studies in different of think tanks doing those roles. And I tried very hard to get them across regions. So you can see there are a range of government and non-government, non-profit, and academic think tanks. Okay, now I won't go through those all because we really want to get to the G20, but just to give you a quick example so you get a flavour of what I mean when I'm talking about think tanks doing diplomacy. I'll just look at the ones on negotiation. So the first one there, independent diplomat. This was the one I have to say I was most surprised to find. A think tank directly doing diplomatic negotiations. Okay. What it is it was set up by a former UK diplomat, Karen Ross, and its clients are mostly entities that aren't states yet. Okay, so it works for the Syrian opposition or Kosovo. It works for some lower capacity states, so some Pacific Island states in international climate negotiations, where they don't have the strength of a diplomatic service themselves and they want to hire someone to do it. So, an example of direct negotiation being done by a think tank. On the indirect side, I chose clearly the Netherlands Institute of International Affairs because it's become very, very well known in terms of its diplomatic training. Okay. So here what they're doing is helping diplomats learn to be better negotiators. They're supporting that diplomatic function. So whether it's through their conferences, their guides, their trainings, their books, they're trying to improve the quality of diplomatic representation and negotiations. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about think tank diplomacy, that think tanks can directly or indirectly contribute to those diplomatic functions to international affairs. My question then is this happening with the G20? Okay, so think tanks have been formally involved, of course they were involved before that, but they were formally involved since Mexico's presidency. So as well as the engagement groups, we've heard about the B20, the business side, the C20, the community, L20 for labour, and more recently we have the W20, which you've heard about, and the Girls 20, which you've heard about. And the idea of these is that they're bringing together think tankers, researchers, at least once, usually twice, during the presidency year, to have input into the G20 agenda and policy making. Now, they started off, I think, fairly small. So the think tank that was asked by the government to do this, to host it for the year, would choose the topics that think tank thought were most important for the agenda. they'd invite experts in those areas and they'd have round tables, they might produce policy papers. I mean, I was involved, for example, with Australia's hosting a year, and we were focusing on things like tax reform, tax erosion, profit shifting, and local infrastructure, which were two of those fixtures. And the idea of that is they bring together people, they have policy papers, and then it goes to the G20 and hopefully ends up influencing there. Now, some were smaller, some were bigger. So I mean, Turkey was probably on the smaller side. China was probably the largest to that point. But for me, the turning point was really the German hosting year, both for scale and for the establishment of the task forces. And we then saw that continuing through Argentina's year, which just happened, both on scale and task forces. So the idea now is that these task forces, which were announced during the China's G20 summit by Germany, they set topics and then they ask think tanks in those areas to be involved. And if you volunteer, which you don't have to, you then have a real job to do. You have to produce a policy paper or provide some data or do something which actually gives you a space on that working group. Those inputs are then shared through their blog and on their this website. Interestingly, it hasn't just been limited to G20 in the country, so there has been quite a lot of outreach. So, particularly South African Institute of International Affairs has worked on exchange and outreach to African think tanks. And I suppose what I saw in Buenos Aires in particular was that this is now really quite institutionalised. Argentinian think tanks hadn't previously been involved at all in this process. They've been notably absent for a lot of time, but they really just took the Germany model on and kept it going. And I think that's useful, that it's actually getting something beyond what the think tank who is given it each year decides to do. You've already heard that I'm a bit worried about Saudi Arabia's year and their capacity to continue, but hopefully the institutionalisation will keep that going. So, I mean, what you're seeing there is that the argument for the G20 and what it's trying to do is bring innovative ideas, quality data, advocacy of useful positions into officials' discussions. So it's connecting the G20 with officials. So, to come back to where I started, is the G20 an example of think tanks doing diplomacy? Now, I will say yes. And I suggest we're going to read this from top right to left like it's a manga, yeah? So, on top right, safe space, yes, absolutely. This creates a space where officials and non-officials can conduct 1.5-track dialogue. So, it does that, absolutely. Secondly, information gathering. Témoignage is bearing witness, if people don't know that word. In terms of actual data gathering, yes, I think again it does it. So, obviously something like the OECD has an intergovernmental think tank that does data gathering, but lots of others do too. And if I can say here, the work of the G20 Research Group and RANEP, that's valuable data gathering, really important, and it goes into this. In terms of direct communication, again, yes, I think some of the think tanks who attend are there with a very clear messaging about what they want to share with the others in the room. And they're doing that on behalf of an overall government messaging. So I see quite a lot of direct side happening. And absolutely, on the next column, on the indirect. So yes, Wise Council, think tanks are there to share their views with officials, both summit through the communicators. And I think in terms of Chief Knowledge Officer, they also set a program for areas for the agenda. As well as what they're putting in, they may be saying, these are the areas we have to do more work on, this is what needs to be investigated. So if I was going to do more work on this, which I'd love to actually, if I wasn't going on long service leave, I would probably spend some time writing this up as an example. There's a lot of questions I want to put in more, to really assess the T20 process. And I'd be interested, even among your networks, if you know people who have been to many of the T20s. I think it's actually a very small group who've been to most of them. It's a very different group of people each time. So at one point I would like to do that. But at this point, I'm interested, I suppose I was interested in this as, again, a real life example of how think tanks have an input into the real world, whether we call it diplomacy or not, it's a definitional question. But I think the G20 is a very good example of think tanks mobilising and setting up structures to make sure that their voices are heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Next, John Courtney.
Climate change and the G20 governance thereof. Climate change is the process of globalization that is most advanced, indeed complete. What goes up and doesn't come down anywhere affects all living things on the planet, everywhere. Secondly, climate change is where globalization has its most pronounced, deadly effect on all living things. Thirdly, climate change is where the inherited multilateral system of 1944 and 1945, the Bretton Woods United Nations firmament, has failed the most. The Charter of the United Nations makes no reference to even the existence, let alone the value, of the natural environment. And flash forward to more recent times. The best we have by way of a global environmental governor for an integrated biosphere is a mere program of the United Nations, headquartered off the beaten track down in Kenya, as I recall. Fourth, it is the G20 members collectively that overwhelmingly have predominant capability in the international system, both for the emissions up and the sinks that come down. So I think it's especially important, given the recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in particular, to look at how well G20 climate change governance has done and how it can be improved. The facts are these. First, from 2008 to 2016, G20 summits made 53 precise, future-oriented, politically binding commitments on climate change. They first mentioned the subject at second summit, London, April 1st to 2nd, perhaps because of a nudge from a think tanker of an ancient generation, the Club of Rome. Ask your grandparents about that one. Perhaps the second most important contribution that think tankers made to the London summit. Second, how well have they complied with these 53 commitments? Assume for the moment they're the right ones. The answer is 65%, that's low. The overall average for the G20 during this time is about 71%. We look at the most recent summit from that period. That was Hangzhou, 2016. And I well recall the day before it opened, President Xi spoke to 800 CEOs from the Business 20 and said memorably, green mountains and clean water are as good as gold and silver. But Hangzhou, at the end of the summit, produced very few commitments to control climate change. And the ones they did were complied with as poorly as the average of before. All sounds very gloomy, but there is hope. We come to Hamburg, 2017, the second last one. At the Hamburg summit, leaders made across all issues 529 commitments, almost double than any summit before. And as I think we heard from Elizabeth this morning, across all of those subjects, compliance reached a new peak of 87%. And if you look at the climate change ones, there were 22 of those commitments on climate change some in a separate document, the G20 Hamburg Climate and Energy Action Plan. And we now know how well they've been complied with, 87% on par with the new peak. So think of the Hamburg hope before we plunge back into despair. What did it do right? And can Osaka do it again? Buenos Aires, the fifth point. I think performance was a solid. 86 commitments in the communique. They included 4 on climate change. And you have to remember that Hangzhou, which did poorly, that was Barack Obama's last summit as a North American, I say. But Hamburg, Donald Trump's first, the great surge. So I don't think Donald Trump has a veto on what the G20 can do. Well, it was there at Buenos Aires, and we had 4 commitments on climate change, 6 on energy. Together, that's about 12% of the total number of commitments made. So the G20 is still in the climate change control game. We'll only know almost 7 months from now what the compliance with those commitments is. If we look ahead to the Osaka summit, I think there is promise for its ability to control climate change for some of the reasons I outlined this morning when I looked at the prospective agenda. And here, I'll not only recall climate change there on Abe's list, natural disasters on the supportive finance track, but if you go back to number 1, quality infrastructure, that means climate resilient infrastructure. The challenge is, I think, to mainstream climate change throughout all of the priority themes. For example, we know climate change is intricately linked to human health, so health, climate change. The agenda's there, it's only that the links now have to be forged. Finally, let's assume that the G20 leaders have actually made the right commitments, and that it's largely compliance that they need to improve. We have some hints, evidence-based hints now about how they can do it. One of the strongest ones that survive our regression equations is ministerial meetings. If you have more ministerial meetings in advance of a summit, compliance goes up. And if you have one on the same subject, and Japan is doing one on the environment, compliance with the commitments made at the summit goes up. So further hope for Osaka. But you still have to make the right commitments, and what are they? To control climate change, we only have to do 10 things. Let me start with 1. It's one that the G20 committed to, all of them, a long time ago at the Pittsburgh summit, September 2009. That was to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term, which anybody who speaks the English language knows means about 5 years. The International Monetary Fund, the OECD, anybody who's looked at it, says if you just comply with that one commitment, you can solve 10 to 20% of the problem of emissions going up into the atmosphere. And if you're into co-benefits, you can save the hard-pressed taxpayers and treasuries of the G20 $5.3 trillion. Save a lot of lives, cut corruptions. So the challenge is to figure out how G20 governors can actually comply with the commitments they make on that and other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Mark Elder.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mark Elder. I'm at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, and today I would like to talk about the G20 and Sustainable Development Goals. As the first point I would like to make is, I'm not sure if people know about this, but actually G20 has an SDG action plan already. It was adopted in 2016 in Hangzhou, China. It's 16 pages. And the SDGs have been mentioned in the Leaders' Declaration for the last 3 years. I haven't really heard them talk about too much about it, so I was wondering if they were going to talk about it this year, but actually it was in fact mentioned in Argentina, in the communique from Argentina. Now it is does tend to be like just one point among many, but anyway, it is there. And this is also in big contrast to climate change issues. So for example, I mean in particular, President Trump of the US in 2017 for climate, the US I think did not join the consensus, and that even also in this, and last time it was a footnote, this time it was another paragraph number, actually, that the US is not joining into the consensus. But the US did, under President Trump, joined in the consensus on the SDGs. So that, I'm not sure if he knows that SDG 13 is on climate change. And anyway, so, and then I'm glad to hear at this meeting there's been a lot of talk about the kind of like institutionalization of G20, and it's that they create a development working group to be in charge of coordinating the G20's implementation of their SDG action plan in cooperation with the other working groups. So anyway, here's the text. I won't read the whole thing. It doesn't say very much. The last part of the paragraph mentions a few specific actions, and it's not very comprehensive, but anyway, the countries are clearly committed. So I won't, of course, read all 16 pages of the SDG action plan, but anyway, people have criticized SDGs for having 17 goals. That's too many. The G20 has 14, not many fewer. They're organized in quite a different way, and I indicated here like which are the corresponding SDGs, and I probably should have included some label of like what is SDG 7 for those of you who haven't memorized them all like we have at our institute. But anyway, you can see that. And anyway, this is my just personal indication of the SDGs. Actually, the governments in each of these sectors have indicated like that this sector applies to several SDGs. So they're actually taking the integrated approach to the SDGs, which we recommend, but just to look at the headlines, I put the headlines here. And so if you are counting the numbers, you're wondering maybe which ones are not here. And there are 3 of them. One is SDG 5 on gender equality. Although I think, as was mentioned in the previous, or maybe, so I guess I can't remember if this is mentioned in the previous session, but certainly our Argentina prioritized it, and I think maybe within these their plans they may have mainstreamed gender to some extent, but so it doesn't mean it's not there, but it's not in the headlines. And then the other missing ones are number 14 on oceans and number 15 on land. So these are generally considered to be the most important environmental ones, which although again, if you interpret this as a real integrated approach, so if for example, your infrastructure is climate resilient and environmentally friendly, then that should help you to protect the oceans and land environment. And so the XDG structure itself is not very well, doesn't lend itself to this integrated approach, as you can see, but and anyway, the G20 organized theirs like quite differently than the SDGs themselves. So yeah, so if we, so I guess I've already talked about the comparison between the G20 and Agenda 2030. So another observation you can make is that the G20, also as mentioned earlier in this program, that the G20 tends to focus more on the economic issues, particularly growth, trade, finance, jobs, industry, and not really environmental aspects. Although probably thanks to China and India, there is more emphasis on means of implementation, especially finance. So even so like the number 5, domestic resource mobilization. That's don't rely on others for financing for your development. You develop your own resources for it. So. Yeah, anyway, otherwise the G20 action plan generally follows the sort of traditional G20 priorities. So to some extent they kind of mapped what they're doing already with the SDGs. But also, as some have observed earlier, I think the SDGs also have contributed to this phenomenon of broadening the G20's agenda beyond the traditional economic and financial issues. And also one positive point from my environmental perspective again is that the G20 does seem to be making a big effort to take a kind of integrated approach to the SDGs. So if we look at the implementation at the summits, of course I do not conduct any kind of analysis like John Curtin and his group, but after, in 2017 and 18, they came up with a document called the update, Hamburg update and Buenos Aires update, and this makes the list of all their SDG commitments. It organizes it by their sustainable development sector and lists what working group is in charge of what. So they have at least a framework for implementation. And in the Hangzhou document, it contained like a 1 or 2 page overview of each of the G20 countries. In Hamburg, they skipped any discussion of particular countries, but then in the document that came out last week from Buenos Aires, they reported that 6 countries organized a kind of G20 peer review learning session, kind of like they have at the HLPF, but anyways, 2 sessions with 3 countries each. And they do have a quite number of concrete actions, although yeah, there's some discussion of like what is a concrete action. If you go down them, they're actually maybe not necessarily very substantial, like have the working group do some, conduct analysis of something. They're not always very, very dramatic, but anyway, certainly there's a lot of activity. So my some other overall observations. Interesting, the G20 also links the SDG action plan with the Addis Ababa action agenda, which was before the SDGs on the means of implementation. I think everybody else has forgotten about it. I think some of these points that I've made already. And then my last slide, I don't know if you're getting my PowerPoint or not, but anyway, this is advertising for some of our outputs. Okay, and some final remarks on I think recommendations of way forward. So my overall observation is that a lot of these difficult issues, I think SDGs can help the G20 on, like they're worried about migration or terrorism and so forth. And actually, each individual issue that they discuss in their communique relates to the SDGs, but they don't actually organize the whole communique itself by the SDGs, which I think is interesting. But like as a kind of organizing principle, SDGs might help them to make perhaps more progress on some of these difficult issues. And they need to work more on the environmental dimension. So I will conclude there, and thank you very much.
Mark Elder, thank you very much.
Our last
presenter in this session is Katsuo Matsushita. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure and honor for me to speak to you today, particularly in this beautiful environment. I'd like to express my deepest appreciation for the organizers of this conference. I am now currently serving as leading co-chair of Task Force 3 on Climate and Environment under T20 process. And at the same time, senior fellow of IGES and professor emeritus at Kyoto University. And just to remind that T20 Japan process will develop policy recommendations through 10 task forces steered by several task force co-chairs. And then task force 3 addresses climate change and environment. And each task force will develop several policy briefs, and ultimately task force summary based on policy briefs are developed. And based on a set of task force summaries, T20 report will be developed and submitted to the G20. I think this is a sort of conventional practice. Now, as for the organizers of T20 for next year, there are 3 main organizers. One is ADBI, Asian Development Bank Institution. This is the leading organizer of T20 Japan. And the next one is Japan Institute of International Affairs, JIIA. And then the third one is Institute for International Monetary Affairs, IIMA. And this is according to Melissa-san's categorization. These are all government-affiliated research institutes. One is affiliated to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the other is affiliated to Ministry of Finance. And there is already a website, t20japan.org. But so far, there is very little information. And last week, the first conference, the Inception Conference of T20 Japan was held on the 4th and 5th last week in Tokyo. And you can check the website of the conference. And currently, there are 10 task forces under T20 Japan. The first one is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is JICA Research Institute is responsible for this topic, task force. The second one is an international financial architecture for stability and development. This is by IIMA, International Institute for Monetary Affairs. And the third topic which I am responsible is climate change and environmental issues, covered by Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and MRI, Mitsubishi Research Institute. The fourth task force is on economic effects of infrastructure investment and its financing, covered by ADBI. The fifth one is cooperation with Africa, covered by African Development Tokyo Office and JICA Research Institute. The sixth task force is on social cohesion, global governance, and the future of politics by Japan Institute for International Affairs. Task force 7 is on future of work and education for digital age by ADBI. Task force 8 is on trade, investment, and tax cooperation by RIETI. This is Research Institute for Economy and Trade and Industry, METI related to Research Institute. And task force 9 is small and medium-sized enterprise, SME policy faced with development of financial technology. This is also by RIETI. And task force 10 is on aging population and its economic impact by ADBI. And as for the task force 3, we are setting the following themes. We are in the age of Paris Agreement and the SDGs. G20 countries should work together to realize Paris Agreement and challenge energy and economic transition to a decarbonized and sustainable society while improving people's welfare. And we need proper policy interventions, such as setting ambitious targets or providing proper economic incentives and owning regulatory measures based on sound analysis. These are required, and these are the role of the G20 Task Force 3. And currently, we have 6 co-chairs within the Task Force 3 on climate and environment. Professor Hiroshi Kogiyama, who is a former 28th president of Tokyo University and currently chair of the Mitsubishi Research Institute, and myself, and Professor Miranda Schwarz. She is American, but she currently teaches at the Technical University of Munich, Germany. She is expert on climate policy and climate regime, particularly for USA, Japan, and Germany. And Professor John Curtin, he has kindly agreed to join as a co-chair for this group. And Mr. Gabriel Da Franchi, he is Argentinian. He worked for as a co-chair last in Argentina T20. And we asked Dr. Ajay Mathur, he is the Director General of TERI, India, so he provides this kind of developing countries perspective. And we had a working session last week, and there are some keynote presentation by, for example, by Hiroshi Kogiyama for new vision for platinum society, which is combining the state-of-the-art technology with solving problems that we are facing, such as aging population or climate and energy constraints. And Miranda Schwarz referred to the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees to urgency. And there is a message by Tamishka Singh, who is from TERI, providing developing country perspectives. And currently, we are preparing 5 broad policy views. I will just list the titles in terms of the time constraints. The first one is promotion of constructing zero carbon society by using effective qualitative evaluation of technology and systems, by using some kind of quantitative analysis for the future technology development. We can cope with issues of reducing greenhouse gas emissions more successfully. And the second topic is strengthened actions towards decarbonized and climate resilient society, under which we have 4 components. One is addressing climate fragility and climate security. The second is deciding rules under Paris Agreement to strengthen voluntary activities by each country. We are currently, the COP24 is being held at Katowice in Poland, and the Paris rule is now being discussed. One of the issues is how to strengthen transparency mechanism and encourage countries to work more and higher ambitious goals. The third one is wider application and strengthening of carbon pricing. The fourth one is the decarbonization of consumer lifestyle. And then the third topic is on potential of various renewable energy and its introduction policy in Southeast Asia. The fourth one is revitalizing local economies in harmony with nature, which includes acceleration of circular economy, establishing regional expert panel for efficiency and circular economy, and reduction of resource throughput by servicizing and sharing economy. I think you have heard a lot about sharing economy. By using sharing economy, we can provide better or equal service with less energy and resource inputs. But there are still various barriers or technical or institutional problems to be solved. So this is one of the issues that we would like to present. The fifth one is resource efficiency and circular economy at multiple levels, including revitalization of local economies in harmony with nature, the application of new inclusive growth indicators and natural capital account. And the third one is institutionalized biodiversity as an irreplaceable asset with infinite potential. So these are some of the policy bills that we are preparing, and we hope to invite comments and inputs from other partner organizations. And finally, I must admit that Japanese current climate change policy is not regarded as positive as it should be. According to the evaluation by German Watch, international NGO, a few years ago, they evaluated climate change policy for 68 countries, and Japan ranked the second to the last. The last one was Saudi Arabia. So, because Japan is still expanding or building coal power plants domestically and internationally, and Japanese target is still very low for the year 2030. And Japan has introduced the carbon tax several years ago, but it is one of the lowest, the rate is one of the lowest in the world. 1/40th of Swedish carbon tax. So that the effect to reduce greenhouse gas is very limited. So these are some of the problems that the Japanese climate change policy is being criticized. But I hope through the process of T20 and G20, there will be more progressive policy domestically and internationally. Finally, I have some additional worries. Next year, Japanese government, policymakers will be very busy, particularly climate-related people. We have transition of emperor in March, early March. Then we have IPCC plenary meeting in Kyoto in March. And we have T20 summit in Tokyo at the end of March. And we have ministerial meeting of energy and environment in Karuizawa in June. And we have G20 in Osaka. After that, we have upper house election. So next year, we will be very busy. So I hope your cooperation is very much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for all the panelists for this interesting and diverse presentations. The good news is we still have some time for questions, so I would suggest to take maybe 3 questions first and at once, and then afterwards we can see how much time we still have. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Koide, Osaka University. I'm not a specialist on the climate management international system, but I'd like to ask this question from the all panelists or anybody who can give me a general idea. Yeah, I think there are international organizations like United Nations, which is taking care of international climate change, and also international conventions, international rules, treaties, which are also dealing with climate change. So in that overall international climate management system, to what extent G20 is important compared with other international institutions or in that overall system?
Thank you very much. Kenta?
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Kenta Matsumoto. I'm the 4th year student here. And I would like to ask a question to Dr. Matsushita. So you mentioned that the first goal that you are drafting is to realize zero carbon society. But I was a bit suspicious of putting emphasis on zero carbon because I feel that first of all, there are still some people who are suspicious about the role of carbon dioxide as a primary cause of climate change. And second, if you look at the current situation, some countries are emphasizing the role of nuclear energy as a clean energy, and recently we had a nice future nuclear innovation, something like that. So I was wondering if the nuclear energy can coexist with realizing such society and the other goals, especially the number 4, revitalizing local economies in harmony with nature. I feel if I look at the situation in Fukushima, I'm not sure if still promoting nuclear energy would be necessary for the realization of sustainable society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Amrita and I'm a third-year student of liberal arts at Osaka University of America. And my question is, especially regarding the last presentation, what approach should developing countries take to deal with both development problems and environmental problems at the same time? Because that's...
Thank you. Who would like, panelists would like to take the first question?
I can start. G20 is our only hope. As I mentioned, if we rely on the UN, we will all fry and die within about 12 years. That's the finding of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a report, not to mention the one produced by the US government. I spoke about the Charter and other things. The Paris Agreement, even if there was 100% compliance with all the voluntary commitments at the Paris Agreement, it wouldn't come even close to the target date set of a 2% or 2 Celsius degree rise from pre-industrial levels. But we now know that's not enough. You need 1.5. And of course, we're not even close to 100% compliance. It's more like 1 or 2%. Last time I looked, only 2 little countries had complied in full. And over the past 24 hours to COP24 in Poland, they couldn't even agree to accept the findings of their own Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which is why we have no choice about the G20. Very quickly, climate change is a scientific fact, just like the law of gravity. That was a simple scientific fact, but we discovered that centuries ago. Climate change is a more complex scientific fact, but we've had several centuries of climate science to figure out what's going on and what to do, largely not through the United Nations. Its organization was the World Meteorological Association, the weatherman. They know about atmospheric physics, not about atmospheric chemistry, which is the clear science you need. Second on my list, killer coal. We know coal kills from the moment people go down to mine it. Look at the body count in Japan, right? To the moment it's burned and goes up into the air. Nuclear's down the list, but we should not be scared by superstition. You can remember Tokimura. A few Japanese died in that nuclear accident. None died at 3 Mile Island in the United States. No Germans died from Chernobyl in 1986, right? And Fukushima, yes, some radiation left over, but it was largely the tsunami and not the nuclear plants that killed people. So we need to keep going for as long as possible all the nuclear power plants we have, because they're very climate friendly, which means Germany and Japan, who we would expect to be the climate leaders, are making exactly the wrong choice on nuclear power and going to coal instead. And they've now lured France's Macron into closing down prematurely his nuclear power plants. There's other problems with nuclear, make no mistake about it. But if you want to do everything you can right here, right now, keep nuclear going, kill killer coal.
Thank you very much for very important questions. As for the first question by Professor Koide, Dr. John Carter has already responded. Actually, I was working for the Ministry of the Environment for many years, and I participated in various climate change negotiations. And of course, it is important to have an agreement on treaties or conventions. But the problem is that if you want to make it more sort of binding and compulsory, then some countries will go out, like the United States or like other countries. So we need to have a consensus and action-oriented approaches. So I think we need at government level, and also private company level, and civil society level, all have to work together. And fortunately, there are various new moves among business sectors. For example, the so-called RE100, Renewable Energy 100, which is led by many international big companies like Google, Apple, or IKEA, or Volkswagen. And these countries committed that their operations will be covered all by renewables by certain years. And many Japanese companies, currently 13 companies, committed to the same group. And as you can see, in the United States, President Trump withdrew from Paris Agreement. I mean, actually, he said his intention to withdraw from Paris Agreement. But many states or local authorities, cities, and private sectors, they say that we are still in. They are working to attain the Paris Agreement. And in Japan also, recently, last July, Japan Climate Initiative was established, including, it consists of many leading Japanese companies, as well as private, local authorities, and NGOs and civil society organizations. And of course, and also Hitachi company. Hitachi is now the president of Keidanren is former Hitachi chairman. So that even Hitachi, even Keidanren member countries are now joining Japan Climate Initiative to attain Paris Agreement. So there is a big change. And Prime Minister Abe said in his speech at the Future Investment Initiative Strategy meeting that climate change is not a cost now. It is a source of competitiveness and source of innovation. So it is now becoming a matter of business competition. For example, in the auto manufacturer sector, you cannot, if you do not make transition to a zero-emission vehicle like automobile, electric vehicles or hydrogen-based vehicle, then you will lose your international market. And and also renewable energy, the price of renewable energy is declining rapidly, and in many countries, not in Japan, unfortunately, but now the solar power, wind power is sometimes less expensive than traditional coal power plants or nuclear power plants. So I think the business is working seriously. And as for the question by Kenta-san, of course there are some skeptics, climate skeptics. But if you look at the climate scientists, more than 98% or so, if you look at the IPCC report, they have reviewed all the scientifically peer-reviewed paper, and then they come up with certain consensus views. So please look at carefully at the IPCC report. Sometimes journalists tend to compare skeptics and climate proponents, but actually the proportion is very different in terms of scientific views. So you have to look at the scientific evidence based on solid scientific background. So these are my sort of quick questions, returns. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, I'd like to add a couple of points. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but climate change is already here. You just have to look out the window. We're already paying for it. Tens of billions of dollars in damages caused by storms worsened by climate change. Greenland is melting, Antarctica is melting, and the coastal cities are in grave danger soon. With regard to the issue, there's some issue about the relation between environment and development, and what we need is leapfrogging. There's no reason for developing countries like India to have to pay the enormous cost of the development path that was suffered by the developed countries. SDGs are a key means to link climate and development. And I do agree that the environmental community needs to do a better job of showing the environmental benefits of climate actions, such as, renewable energy creates a lot more jobs than fossil fuels, and in many places it already has, including in the red states in the US. And some of these politicians, they just simply don't know that there are already more renewable jobs in their state than fossil fuel jobs. Anyway, our time is short, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Anybody wants to answer any more for these three questions? Then I think we have time for one more question, or maybe two more questions.
Thank you. I would like to hear more about technology transfer. I think we didn't mention that as another tool to open access for technologies that can help developing countries in particular to deal with climate change. Definitely something not to ignore, but also the idea that the climate change depends on everyone, on every individual, in a way of trying to get the overconsumpting lifestyles change, so everybody can contribute by reducing flying by airplane and by reducing meat consumption and reducing electricity consumption and so on. I actually remember when I was in Japan in 2011 when Fukushima happened, and when effectively we were told simply to reduce electricity consumption, which helped my own electricity bill to be half from what it used to be before. And I even don't think my life changed, somehow deteriorated after that. So there is a scope for that as well, but again, unfortunately everybody adopts commitments, and we see the numbers which John presented, how many commitments only G20 made. But when we hear the last report from UN and from US a few days ago and the Katowice summit in Poland, the picture remains the same as we talk about climate change for the last, 30 years, and there is not much really changing. In fact, it becomes worse and worse every time.
Thank you very much for a very important question on technology transfer. Of course, there are various issues related to the technology transfer. One of the idea that the Japanese government is promoting is a sort of package cooperation. Package means including technology, legal system, capacity building, various expertise, and through in the case of Japanese local authorities like Yokohama City or Kitakyushu City, these cities have already accumulated various capability on managing environment, waste management, water recycling, purification. And with the cooperation with private sector and research institute, these cities, in cooperation with sister city agreement, dispatch a team of experts in providing specific technology as well as its management, legal system, institutionalization, and capacity building. So that is one of the ways to promote technology transfer. And the other is for the developing countries, their priority may be a bit different from developed countries. They have everyday needs for clean water or healthcare, poverty eradication. But if you invest in a coordinated way, then that will create so-called co-benefits. For example, if you provide more small-scale renewable energy that purify the air, that purify water, and that provide job opportunities, that create local sort of revitalization. So this can be the way to transfer technology from developed to developing countries, or even between developing countries, they can share their experiences. Thank you.
Maybe last one from John Curtin.
Yeah, I think technology transfer is not needed. It assumes that there's a tech fix out there, and that we up in the rich north are doing so well because we've got all of the technology, but we're not controlling our climate change. Canada's not meeting its commitment, neither is Germany, and neither is Japan, so on down the line. Australia, I should add, in the spirit of inclusiveness. Look, my list of top 10, none of it requires technology transfer. Stop subsidizing fossil fuels. You can just do it. Kill killer coal, just do it. Close the plants. Grow trees. Brazil doesn't need Canada to send it a conifer to tell it how to grow trees. That's about 10% of the problem, a sink, afforestation, deforestation. Eat plants, not meat, right? The Argentinians know how to grow vegetables as well as raise beef. They had a choice. Walk, don't drive. Now, if you want to move to electric vehicles, right? Well, maybe we can rely on the private sector, Elon Musk, or China. Their technology on electric vehicles is probably ahead of ours, although sure there are plug-ins and batteries. So there is a place in the footnotes for technology to transfer, but I wouldn't wait to solve that one because the problem is here and now, and we can solve it doing straightforward, simple things we know that work.
Thank you very much. I think we have to leave it here. Thank you first for the audience for these brilliant questions, and thank you very much for the panel for this very exciting time here. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll have our coffee breaks over there, and then but the last session we really have to start exactly at 4:45. So please come back here exactly. Bye.